مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. أنهى المفاوضون أكثر من 15 شهرا من المحادثات في فيينا الاثنين الماضي بمخطط يتطلب توقيع الرئيس الأمريكي ونظيره الإيراني وفقا لدبلوماسيين من الاتحاد الأوروبي. وبتنا أمام مسودة اتفاق نهائية من الاتحاد الأوروبي يمكن أن تؤدي إلى توسع كبير في صادرات النفط الإيرانية. وتبقى أمام الولايات المتحدة وإيران أسابيع فقط لتقرير ما إذا كانتا تريدان إحياء اتفاقهما النووي. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة ينضم إلينا واليس سيمونز الكاتب والباحث في شؤون الشرق الأوسط. سيجاك مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you.
دعنا نبدأ بآخر التطورات عن محاولة استهداف جون بولتون التي أعلن عنها بالأمس. جاك سوليفان قال إن إيران أمام عواقب وخيمة. هذه التهديدات هل هي منفصلة عن محادثات النووي مع إيران؟
Well, I think that they must be seen in the same context, which is that from the beginning when Joe Biden took office, his priority was to regain this nuclear deal almost at any cost. And that informed all of the decision making that came after that, by which the Americans took a very, very soft attitude towards Iran that has persisted to the present day. And it feels like the Iranians there's nothing so bad that the Iranians can do that will cause a harsh response from the United States. And this latest development of the threats against John Bolton is another example of that. I mean, the United States talks tough, but then I think that I'll be very surprised if I would see any serious retaliation from the United States, because what they really want is this new nuclear deal.
طيب، عند هذه المرحلة أين وصلت المفاوضات مع إيران؟ هل نحن أقرب إلى إبرام الاتفاق؟
Well, I mean, I think there's always been the possibility of reaching a deal very soon, because the Americans and the Europeans have given the Iranians an extremely good offer, and all the Iranians have had to do is accept it. But instead, what they've done is give signals as if they might accept the offer, and then add further conditions on top of it, stalling and delaying and stalling and delaying, and all the time making progress on their own nuclear program. So in that way, they're giving themselves a stronger and stronger position with each passing month. It was interesting that the European negotiators last week appeared to talk a bit tougher than they normally do. They said to the Iranians that they've got a deal on the table. Now's the time for yes or no. They're not going to make any further adjustments. And that was all very well. But the problem is they didn't put a time limit on it. So it didn't seem as if they really meant it. If they would have said yes or no by next Monday, then that would focus the Iranian mind. But they didn't. They said yes or no and reply whenever you like. So this sense of pressure has really been lacking, and it continues to be lacking now. And the Iranians don't have any incentive really to move from their position.
المقترح الأوروبي لإحياء الاتفاق النووي جاء فيه أو فيما سرب من نصوصه أنه سيؤدي إلى توسيع صادرات إيران النفطية. هل نحن نحل مشكلة إيران النووية أم مشكلة الطاقة الأوروبية؟
Well, I think the energy crisis has come into the middle of these negotiations and changed things quite a lot. One of the things that the war in Ukraine has done is to polarize the West and Russia in a way that wasn't the case when they lined up on the same side to negotiate with Iran. And Russia and Iran have been thrown closer together, along with China. As we know, the China-Taiwan dynamic is one that's very difficult for the West as well. And so we're developing this triangle of Iran, China, and Russia, who are developing methods to help each other avoid the impact of Western sanctions, and developing a degree of autonomy. And so it feels like, again, with each passing month, the effect of Western sanctions becomes more and more soft, and the Iranians and their allies develop a greater capacity to evade their effects. And of course, that extends in some ways into the Gulf, because the UAE is still buying a lot of Iranian oil, despite the Abraham Accords. Relations with Iran have been actually warming with some of the Gulf states in recent months. And so it does seem to the observer that the Iranians are really playing a very good game at the moment and are managing to get a lot of the advantages while not giving up anything of their nuclear program at all.
إدارة بايدن جددت الإعفاءات من العقوبات المرتبطة ببرنامج إيران النووي من دون تنازلات من النظام الإيراني كأنها هدية مجانية. ما الهدف هنا؟
Well, I think that the goal has been, as it always has been, as I've said from the beginning, which is to revive the nuclear deal at all costs. And the negotiating team which Biden employed are from the extreme end of the extreme dovish end of the spectrum. And they don't really know how to table tough action. I mean, sometimes there are joint military operations with Gulf states, with Israel. Sometimes they do symbolic gestures of testing out technology that could be used in the future in a strike on nuclear facilities. But basically, the Americans tend to be all carrot and very little stick. And this freebie is another example of that. There's a sense that if they just, give the Iranians what they want and give them more and more, the Iranians might be tempted to sign. Whereas, as we all know, that doesn't work. As we've all seen, that doesn't work. There needs to be a big stick as well as a carrot. And all carrot just doesn't work.
بالمقابل هل لانت إيران؟ هل تغيرت مواقفها؟
Well, I think that the Iranians are just pursuing the same strategy of stalling for time while they make progress on their nuclear weapons program and boast about it. I mean, one thing we've seen in the last month is boasts from the Iranian side about how much progress they have made, taunting the West and Western allies, Israel and Gulf states. Also, I mean, the Iranians, there was, if you go back a few months, there was a sense that the Iranians that a deal was very, very close. Sources that I know who were involved in the negotiations were sending me messages saying, yes, we expect it to be this week. We expect it to be beginning of next week. And then that was when the idea suddenly appeared of taking the Iranian Revolutionary Guards off the terror list, and which initially Western powers saw that as a parallel issue, not part of the negotiations. But it's since become the sticking point. And politically, it's not something that the Biden administration can accept. And so it's a very convenient way for the Iranians to keep these talks in a sort of half-life, stretching them on and on and on, while they reap more and more advantages with each passing month.
وزير خارجية إيران تعهد بالتعاون مع الوكالة الذرية بشرط أن تنأى بنفسها عن الانحرافات السياسية. بناء على ماذا يتهم وكالة الطاقة بتسييس أزمة إيران النووية؟
Well, he actually said that he would only cooperate with the IAEA if the watchdog body agreed to stop pursuing the traces of nuclear material found at various sites around the country. So he said, well, you stop investigating us and we'll cooperate with you. And that's not really a deal which any sensible watchdog should take, because those traces of nuclear material at various sites secret sites around the country, are evidence, hard evidence potentially, even more hard. We have the hard evidence already, but more hard evidence that the Iranians have been breaking the terms of the JCPOA even when it was intact. And that implies that the Iranians were never to be trusted from the beginning. They're not to be trusted now. And the fact that the Biden administration and Western powers on the whole have not woken up to that fact and are still trying to tempt them to come on board with this deal, which anyway expires very soon with the sunset clauses not being extended, is quite laughable, frankly. The Iranians, I'm afraid, at the moment are experiencing all the advantages, and the West is seeming like a joke from the Iranian point of view.
السعودية حذرت من أنها ستطور سلاحا نوويا خاصا بها إذا حصلت إيران على سلاح نووي. هل باعتقادك حصول إيران على السلاح النووي يمكن أن يطلق سباقا للتسلح في المنطقة؟
Yes, I mean, one of the dangers of Iran getting a nuclear weapon is that it would trigger an arms race in the region that would draw in the United States and other Western allies as well, in order to fund allies against the Iranian threat. And this is a very real and present danger. I think the chances of Iran actually launching a nuclear weapon and using it, I would like to believe are fairly slim, although you can never trust the regime and you don't know how they're going to behave. But I think that the important thing to recognize is that right now, the Iranians have the West and Western allies on the end of a string, that they are getting closer and closer to nuclear thresholds. I mean, they are a nuclear threshold state. They can break out to achieve a nuclear weapon in a short amount of time. I mean, the different people give different lengths of time, but it could be as much as as little as a few months. And the longer these negotiations are stretched on, the shorter that breakout time becomes. And the Iranians have such an advantage against the West and Western allies. It's like, our side will suddenly have to start, we're dancing more and more to the Iranian tune, for example, not responding to the John Bolton threat because we're afraid of what the Iranians might do and the arms race that might result. And so the Iranians are placing themselves in a very, very strong geopolitical position.
عند مراقبة نمط هذه المفاوضات على مدى أشهر الآن، هل يمكننا توقع شكل الاتفاق الذي سيصدر عنها؟
I think it will be it would be a more for less deal, whereby the Americans, Western allies, and allies of the West in the region wouldn't even be able to pretend that they had achieved anything for themselves apart from this signing of the paper, and all the substantial benefits would flow into the Iranian direction. In a more for less scenario, they would retain their nuclear threshold status, to be honest. They would receive sanctions relief, even though they're pivoting to Russia and to China. Sanctions relief from the West would still be worth billions of dollars, which would then fund their mischief making and destabilization throughout the region. And it would almost certainly be a very soft deal that would place Iran in an even stronger position than they are currently. But having said that, I think that Iran is in such a good position, I can't imagine it signing any kind of deal anytime soon.
عند هذه المرحلة هل بقي ما يمكن فعله؟ تحديدا بالنسبة للدول التي تشعر بتهديد إيران مثل إسرائيل ودول الخليج.
Yes, I mean, I think that the military option needs to be beefed up. The United States needs to commit to much more military support in the Gulf. Israel already has a guarantee of a quantitative edge, but the Gulf needs to get a much more firm and long-term military guarantee, which would then allow Gulf powers to resist the Iranian seduction attempt, which has been successful recently, and come back into the more fully into the Western orbit. And then there needs to be a hard time deadline on the Iranians, take it or leave it, in terms of this deal. And if you leave it, then there will be what some Israeli analysts have called a controlled crisis, by which I mean that that various different preparations need to be made in advance of that to place more pressure on the Iranians with regards to sanctions, with regard to the international banking system, with regards to countering them militarily throughout the region without tripping into all-out war, so that gradually they feel the squeeze again. And that is the only thing. Don't forget, the JCPOA originally only happened because of sanctions. The Iranians only agreed to it because of the stick rather than the carrot. We have seen over the past 2-3 years that having carrot and no stick doesn't work. You've got to have a big stick, and the West and its Gulf allies have got to wake up to that fact.
شكرا جزيلا لك سيد جاك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you.
شكرا على طيب المتابعة مشاهدينا، إلى الملتقى.